Hi everyone, here's our video on the French and Indian War. You may hear it sometimes called the 7 Years' War. That's what it's referred to in Europe, even though it was technically 9 years. The French in Canada may call this the Wars of Conquest. So if you ever get confused, it's actually the same thing. Some of you may be familiar from this if you visited Lake George. You see Fort William Henry here. This was a fort that was used in the French and Indian War, as it shows in their flowers in 1755. So if you've been there or seen it, put it in perspective of what we're learning about today. So here's a little bit of background. The French were sort of late in terms of coming to the New World, but in some ways not really, because they established Quebec in 1608. That's only 1 year after Jamestown, if you remember. New France was expanding in North America, and they had a very effective relationship with the natives, more so than the other countries that were colonizing here. The British sought basically to remove or exterminate the natives. The Spanish sought to Christianize them and subdue them via the encomienda system and other labor systems, whereas the French became like good gift givers and learned the benefits of trading with the locals. And that really does help them in the French and Indian War. Soon in the Americas, there becomes a clash of empires, mainly the English, the Spanish, and the French. Many historians will refer to these as the first world wars, actually. There was the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the colonial wars for about that 3 decades. But the King George's War was fought in 1744 to 1748. I think I cut off my slide a little bit. You see there, King George's War. And that was when Spain allied with France against Britain in King George's War. This was not the first colonial war. When we talk about the French and Indian War, this map is of various battles involved with Queen Anne's War, where British colonials were fighting the French and the native populations, except for the Mohawks and the Iroquois Confederacy. So the French and Indian War is not the first, but it's pretty much the most important or the most significant. So let's look at some of the origins. The British were pushing west into the Ohio Valley off the coastline. And that's sort of where the French were. The French needed the Ohio Valley. It connected Canada, where they were, with the lower Mississippi Valley, and eventually these waters connect some of their islands in the Caribbean. So it was really important for them for trade. A young Lieutenant Colonel George Washington was sent by the Virginia government to stop the French from building a fort there. And he was defeated. He didn't do well at all. Some people say actually he even triggered a world war by his failures there. So it didn't go too well. And then the British responded by clamping down on Nova Scotia, which is where some more French were. They relocated 4,000 people from there throughout the continent, including to Louisiana, which is why you have a lot of French influence in Louisiana today. The war widened at this point into the largest world war at this point, and 25,000 colonial Americans actually fought in this war, so pretty significant. So now we have the Albany Congress. Great Britain's Board of Trade called leaders from all different colonies to meet in Albany, which is in New York, right? It's the capital today, to discuss the Indian problem, as they called it, and to meet with the Iroquois. The Iroquois refused here to commit themselves to the British, which of course didn't make them very happy. But they did have another long-range goal, and that was for greater colonial unity, to try to get these various British colonies in the Americas to unite, and to be able to create a strong defense against France, which they thought may be encroaching on them or getting land that they eventually wanted. So the Albany Plan did lead to a plan for union. Ben Franklin, we all know him, he made a plan for colonial home rule, which becomes important later when we think of our revolution, and it also to help deal with defense against Indian issues. This was adopted by all the delegates. However, individual colonies rejected it because they didn't think it gave them enough independence if they joined. Okay, so think of this later as um, why some states were reluctant to leave the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution because of states' rights. It begins with colonial rights. The British also rejected it because they thought it gave the colonies too much independence. So the Albany Congress is pretty important when it comes to all these central themes and ideas. Okay, now let's get a little bit into the war itself. So we basically have the French against the British. The French had many advantages. They controlled access to waterways in the interior of North America. They had one single colonial government, right? They didn't have New York and Massachusetts and Virginia. It was just one colonial government. That helped them do things quickly. They also had professional soldiers, not volunteers like the British did. However, the British did have more people. The colonies being along the coast made them easier to defend. And the colonists were permanent settlers, which meant they were really willing to fight and save their home. A few of the important people involved here, we have GW, of course. He was ordered by the Virginia governor to drive out the French at the Ohio River. As I mentioned before, it failed. He was pretty young and inexperienced at this point in his military career. He picked a spot that was charming. Considering the military, you don't want to look for charming spots. You want parts that are strategically important. The spot was low in a valley, which allowed the French to surround them and see them, so that's not good. It was very much raining during this time, and there was nowhere for the water to drain out, and that soaked all of his men's gunpowder and other supplies. The French eventually took this over, named it Fort Necessity. We also have Edward Braddock. He led the second attempt to drive the French out of the Ohio River Valley after GW didn't do well. He also failed. A big reason why? The British were wearing red coats, right? Not smart because you can be seen and ambushed even though you might look fancy. We also have William Pitt. He was Britain's Secretary of State who put lots of money into this war for supplies and weapons and furnished more troops. This becomes an issue in our revolution when the British explain why we're being taxed so much because they spent all this money to defend us from the French. Okay. Then we have Pontiac, who some of you mentioned last class with your Native American wars. He was an Ottawa chief. He was upset with the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which comes at the end, which gave basically no land to his people. And then he began that 2-year uprising, which you guys discussed, attacking white settlers in the Ohio River valleys, burning their cabins and all those sorts of things. All right, so now things are getting heated up. In 1755, the British general Braddock was defeated a few miles from Fort Duquesne by smaller French and Indian forces. The British also then failed in a full-scale invasion of Canada in 1756. William Pitt then becomes the leader of the British government. He's very popular among his people. And his success in the war actually led to Fort Duquesne being renamed Pittsburgh. So if any of your Steelers fans there, you might find that interesting. Okay, then we have the Battle of Quebec in 1760, where Pitt appointed General James Wolfe to take Quebec. I think that's who your journal entry was will be from next class. The British were successful near Quebec, but Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm was killed, and that's a big thing about this battle. So it was actually one of the most significant battles in British and American history. Hi.
Hi. How's it going?
All right, how are you?
Good. Sorry, you in the middle.
No, that's all right. So let's talk about the Peace of Paris. I'm sorry. France lost all their claims in North America except New Orleans to the British. And Spain had to give up Florida to Britain. And since Spain had sided with France during the war, France ended up giving up its claim to all Louisiana west of Mississippi River to Spain. So you really do want to know some of these effects. I'm going to get more to it on part 2 of the French and Indian War.